Industrial northern England in the early 1880s moved at a slow, smoky pace, shaped by mills, narrow streets, and modest homes. Within this setting lived Mary Ann Britland, an ordinary working woman whose quiet path would eventually lead investigators toward one of the era's most unsettling criminal histories known. Welcome to Darkest Files, and thank you for joining me today. Share where you are listening from, and feel free to subscribe to stay connected as we explore this story. The industrial towns of Manchester and Ashton under Lyne formed a landscape of steady movement and muted struggle in the early 1880s. Rows of brick terraces lined the narrow streets, each house built close to the next, with little more than a shallow front step separating private lives from the world outside. Smoke drifted from factory chimneys throughout the day, settling across the rooftops like a permanent haze. The sound of carts, factory whistles, and distant footsteps blended into a slow, familiar rhythm that shaped the routines of working families. In this environment, people lived by habit and necessity, and the patterns of daily life were rarely questioned. It was here that Mary Ann Britland carried out her quiet existence, blending almost seamlessly into the neighborhood's unremarkable routines. Mary Ann was born into the working class, surrounded by the expectations and limitations that defined life for many women of her social standing. By the time she entered adulthood, she had married Thomas Britland, a laborer whose modest earnings supported their household. Their home was simple, furnished with the essentials, and maintained with the careful attention that working families took pride in. Mary Ann contributed to the household income when she could, often taking cleaning jobs or working in the mills depending on availability. Her days were shaped by housework, errands, and occasional visits with neighbors. Nothing about her outward appearance or behavior suggested anything unusual, and her life seemed set on a predictable path. To those around her, she was one of many women managing a household with limited means and quiet persistence. The neighborhood where the Britlands lived was typical of the region. Families occupied small rented homes with narrow staircases, steep backyards, and cramped kitchens warmed by coal fires. Children played in the alleyways, running between the houses with the energy that adults envied but seldom expressed. Women carried baskets from market stalls, while men walked to and from work with steady steps. It was a community built on shared hardships and quiet resilience. Neighbors noticed each other's comings and goings out of habit rather than curiosity. Gossip spread occasionally, but most people were too occupied with their own difficulties to pay close attention unless something directly affected them. Mary Ann moved through this world with a calm and orderly presence. She maintained her home, prepared meals, and kept a regular schedule that rarely wavered. She was neither warm nor distant, simply steady, giving little indication of her private thoughts. Her marriage to Thomas had endured the usual strains of working-class life, including financial challenges and periods of uncertainty. Yet nothing about their relationship appeared exceptional to those who knew them. They were viewed as another ordinary couple navigating the demands of their environment, doing what was necessary to get by. The stillness of their domestic routine made what followed later all the more difficult for the community to understand. In the early months of the year, Mary Ann's employment at times brought her into homes where she performed cleaning duties or simple domestic tasks. Her work allowed her access to certain materials that, though common in many households of the era, required caution. Among these were various substances used for pest control, including powders and liquids that were kept in small containers and purchased from local chemists. These items were part of everyday life, stored in cupboards or pantries, handled without much thought because people had grown accustomed to their presence. In Mary Ann's home, one such bottle rested near the pantry shelf, positioned beside jars of baking staples and household tools. Its placement seemed unremarkable to anyone who might have observed it, another item in a house filled with necessities. The financial strain on the Britland family gradually grew more noticeable. Seasonal work meant fluctuating income, and unexpected expenses often disrupted whatever small stability they managed to create. The cost of food, clothing, and coal weighed heavily on budgets, leaving little room for comfort or security. Thomas worked steadily when he could, but the demands of physical labor, coupled with the harsh environment of factories and mills, took a toll on many men of his age. Illness was common and often accepted as part of life. In a time before advanced medical care, people endured ailments with patience, hoping for improvement but often receiving little more than sympathetic words or basic remedies. As the months passed, neighbors noticed subtle signs of strain within the Britland household. Thomas began experiencing periods of discomfort and fatigue, though nothing that seemed unusual for a man working under such constant physical pressure. Mary Ann continued her routines, carrying herself with the same measured calm. Outsiders saw nothing that raised concern, and even those living closest to the family accepted the changes within the home as ordinary. Illness, exhaustion, and stress shaped the lives of many local families, and any shift within a household was likely to be interpreted through that familiar lens. There was no reason, at least at the time, to suspect that something more serious might be unfolding behind the quiet walls of the Britland home. As Thomas's condition worsened, he appeared increasingly frail. The moments when he tried to continue his work grew shorter, and his attempts to rest offered little relief. The small kitchen became the center of their domestic life, a place where Mary Ann prepared meals and carried out the daily tasks that kept the household functioning. The bottle she kept near the pantry remained in its spot, undisturbed and seemingly insignificant. Its presence blended into the background of the room, just another tool in a home where every object had a purpose. Yet it would be this item, unnoticed and unremarked upon, that later investigators would examine with great care. The neighborhood moved at its usual pace, unaware of the developing troubles within the Britland family. People passed by the house without giving it much attention. The days were filled with the sound of carts on the road and the distant hum of machinery. Children ran along the street, stopping occasionally to glance toward the open doorway where Mary Ann sometimes stood. The air carried the familiar smell of coal, mixed with the damp chill that settled over the town during the cooler months. Life continued, unhurried and predictable, even as tension slowly formed inside the Britland home. Nothing in these early events broke the rhythm of the community, and nothing suggested that Mary Ann would become the focus of one of the most troubling criminal investigations of the era. Her life seemed defined by routine, shaped by the environment around her, and carried forward by the expectations placed upon her. Yet beneath the quiet exterior of this household, a sequence of events had already begun, events that would later draw the attention of neighbors, doctors, and authorities. The pantry shelf, with its ordinary assortment of items, waited silently, holding one detail that would take on increasing importance as the story unfolded. And there, amid the flour, utensils, and neatly arranged jars, rested the small bottle of household chemicals that Mary Ann kept within easy reach. The small bottle on the pantry shelf remained untouched as the days settled into their familiar cycle, yet its quiet presence seemed to linger in the kitchen like an unnoticed witness. Mary Ann moved around it with the same calm precision she applied to all her tasks, neither drawing attention to it nor attempting to hide it. The kitchen was narrow, its surfaces worn from years of use, and the coal fire occasionally cast a soft glow across the room in the late afternoon. It was here that Thomas spent more of his time as his strength continued to fade. The change was subtle at first, a slow withdrawal from his usual routines, but soon the signs became difficult to ignore. His once steady gait grew uncertain, and the fatigue etched itself into the lines of his face. Neighbors who caught glimpses of him remarked quietly that he seemed older than his years, yet none could have predicted the course his decline would take. Thomas's illness emerged gradually, blending into the ordinary concerns of working men in industrial towns. Many suffered from chest complaints, muscle exhaustion, and unexplained aches brought on by harsh labor and polluted air. A man falling ill rarely caused alarm unless the symptoms progressed quickly or dramatically. In Thomas's case, the progression seemed slow enough to appear natural, but persistent enough to cast a shadow over the household. He complained of cramps that seemed to seize him without warning, sharp pains that interrupted his attempts to sleep, and a general restlessness that left him pale and unsteady. Mary Ann tended to him with a steady hand, preparing broths, adjusting his bedding, and offering him the simple remedies available to them. She spoke little of his condition to others, yet her composure left those who interacted with her believing she managed her situation with stoic acceptance. As Thomas grew weaker, neighbors began to notice small changes in the rhythm of the Britland home. The door, once opened frequently as Thomas came and went from work, remained closed for longer periods. The sounds of daily routines shifted slightly, the scrape of a chair, the clink of dishes, and the slow, deliberate movements within the house carried a new heaviness. The coal fire burned earlier in the day, and the windows seemed to fog more often, suggesting that Thomas spent most of his time indoors. In working-class neighborhoods, such changes did not immediately draw suspicion, but they did mark a household in quiet distress. People spoke in hushed tones about Thomas's failing health, sharing sympathetic remarks while acknowledging that illness, even severe illness, was an all too familiar part of life. Mary Ann continued her duties with measured efficiency, moving through her tasks with a calm that others might later recall with unease. She laundered clothes, swept the floors, and maintained the kitchen with unwavering regularity. To the casual observer, she appeared to shoulder her responsibilities without complaint. Her reserved nature, once perceived simply as part of her personality, took on a slightly sharper edge as the days passed. She seldom visited neighbors, choosing instead to remain at home. Her isolation seemed understandable, given her husband's condition, and no one questioned it openly. Yet in the stillness of her domestic routine, subtle tensions grew, only noticeable in hindsight when the true nature of these events came to light. As Thomas's worsening health constrained the household further, financial pressures tightened their grip. Mary Ann managed their limited funds with careful calculation, stretching what they had as far as possible. She cut back on food where she could, purchased only essential items, and kept a close eye on every expense. Coal was rationed cautiously, and the house felt colder than usual even as winter approached. The small pantry became a carefully controlled space, with every jar and container placed precisely where Mary Ann wanted it. The bottle of household chemicals remained in its familiar position, as unremarkable as the spices and flour that surrounded it. Thomas, weakened and weary, took little notice of the items around him, focusing instead on the waves of discomfort that continued to engulf him. The early signs of something more alarming appeared during the evenings, when Thomas attempted to rest. Neighbors later recalled hearing faint sounds from the Britland home, irregular thumps or muted groans that suggested a man in distress. Mary Ann offered explanations when asked, describing his symptoms in vague yet plausible terms, portraying them as part of a troubling but not unexpected decline. Without access to advanced medical care, most families relied on home remedies and optimism. Doctors were summoned only when illness became extreme or when families had no other option. In the Britlands' case, a physician visited briefly, offering little more than reassurance and simple advice. He attributed Thomas's complaints to the strain of physical labor and possibly a common ailment affecting the digestive system. His observations, though routine, shaped the early interpretation of Thomas's illness and eased any suspicions that might have arisen. Mary Ann maintained a quiet but deliberate watch over Thomas during these days. She offered him drinks, checked his blankets, and prepared meals that he struggled to finish. Her movements remained controlled and precise, giving the impression of a woman managing her duties without emotional display. In a community where many women faced similar burdens, her demeanor was not unusual. Yet in retrospect, her calm appeared almost too steady, too measured, especially as Thomas's symptoms grew more severe. He experienced convulsions at times, episodes of intense discomfort that left him gripping the edge of the bed. His breathing grew labored, and his expressions betrayed fear and confusion. These moments passed quickly, leaving him exhausted and Mary Ann composed as she resumed her tasks. As the severity of Thomas's condition became harder to hide, whispers spread among the neighbors. People wondered aloud whether he might be suffering from a serious fever or a rare infection. The rapid shifts in his condition, alternating between brief moments of apparent stability and sudden episodes of intense distress, puzzled those who heard about them. Some speculated about food poisoning or contaminated water. Others simply shook their heads, accepting that illness could strike unexpectedly, often without clear explanation. The lack of medical knowledge left room for many interpretations, and Mary Ann's reserved manner allowed these interpretations to drift without challenge. Inside the house, the air grew heavy with anticipation. Thomas's periods of rest became shorter, and the spasms that overtook him left his limbs rigid and unresponsive. Mary Ann tended to him throughout these episodes, her actions deliberate, her expression unchanged. She kept the windows closed to retain warmth, yet the room remained dim and cold, the light from the fire flickering weakly against the walls. The pantry stood only a few steps away, its shelves neatly arranged, the bottle still resting in its familiar spot, untouched yet central to the events unfolding in the household. One evening, as the chill deepened and the streets outside grew quiet, Thomas experienced one of his most severe episodes. The neighbors heard nothing, yet within the small kitchen the tension rose sharply. Mary Ann moved between the stove and the bedside, adjusting the blankets, preparing a simple broth, and observing him with an unreadable expression. His breathing became strained, each gasp sharp and shallow. The spasms that took hold of him lasted longer than before, leaving him trembling before he finally grew still. The moment passed with a heavy silence that settled over the room, a silence that seemed to envelop both the dying man and the woman standing nearby. The next morning, the neighborhood awoke to the news that Thomas had not survived the night. Word spread slowly, carried by quiet remarks exchanged at doorways and over fences. People expressed sympathy for Mary Ann, who appeared composed as she informed those around her of her husband's passing. The community accepted the death with subdued sorrow, viewing it as another tragic but unsurprising event in a world shaped by hardship and limited medical understanding. No one questioned the circumstances openly, and the bottle in the pantry remained undisturbed, its significance not yet recognized by anyone beyond the walls of the Britland home. In the stillness that followed, Mary Ann continued her routines with the same steady calm. The house, now quieter than ever, held small echoes of its former life. The kitchen bore the faint scent of coal and broth, and the narrow hallway seemed longer in the absence of Thomas's footsteps. Yet amid the quiet, one detail remained unchanged, waiting silently on the pantry shelf, its modest shape easily overlooked, its importance still hidden from view. And there, in that carefully arranged space, stood the bottle that Mary Ann kept near the pantry, as visible and out of place as ever, though no one yet understood its role in the story that had only begun. Thomas Britland's final days left an imprint on the small house that Mary Ann maintained with tireless precision. The news of his death moved through the neighborhood in the quiet and steady manner characteristic of working-class communities, where tragedy was familiar yet still met with respectful murmurs and soft condolences. People spoke of Thomas as a man worn down by hard labor, someone who had struggled against the physical burdens of his environment for many years. In their eyes, his passing was sad but understandable. Another life claimed by illness and fatigue. The funeral, modest and understated, reflected both the family's financial limitations and the subdued character of the community. Neighbors stood at a distance or watched from windows as the small procession moved along the street, their faces softened by a mix of sympathy and resignation. There was no hint, not yet, that the quiet death inside the Britland home would later be re-examined with such scrutiny. After Thomas was laid to rest, the house settled into a new rhythm, shaped by the absence of his presence. Mary Ann continued her routines, stepping into the familiar tasks that filled her days. The kitchen, once the center of Thomas's long decline, returned to its usual order. The chair he had occupied near the fire was straightened, the bedding washed, and the room aired out. These acts seemed practical and expected, the natural response of a woman managing her household alone. Neighbors observed her composure and remarked privately on her resilience. Many women in the area had faced similar hardships, losing husbands unexpectedly and adapting with quiet strength. Mary Ann's calm demeanor reinforced the belief that she was simply continuing as best she could, guided by necessity rather than emotion. Within the broader context of industrial England, death was often understood as an unavoidable part of life. Workplace injuries, outbreaks of illness, and sudden health declines were common, and families learned to navigate grief with steady, subdued acceptance. Few questioned the circumstances of Thomas's passing, and fewer still considered the possibility of foul play. Medical examinations at the time were limited, and physicians, overwhelmed by the demands of crowded towns, often attributed unusual symptoms to general weakness or digestive complaints. In Thomas's case, the doctor's earlier visit had provided a simple explanation, one that aligned with the community's understanding of illness. With no evidence to suggest otherwise, the matter was closed quickly, allowing Mary Ann to resume her daily life with little interference. Yet inside the home, subtle changes began to take shape. Mary Ann's daughter, who had been living with her parents during Thomas's decline, continued her own routines, but neighbors later recalled that she appeared quieter than usual. The girl spent more time indoors, perhaps reflecting the somber atmosphere that lingered after her father's death. Mary Ann's interactions with her daughter remained private, and few could describe the nature of their relationship. They lived in close quarters, sharing the small rooms and narrow hallways of the terraced house, but their emotional distance remained largely unobserved. Such discretion was typical in working families, where outward expressions of feeling were often restrained and personal matters kept within the home. Despite the quiet that settled over the Britland household, Mary Ann remained connected to the outside world through her work and her interactions with neighbors. She maintained a regular presence in the community, though her demeanor remained restrained. Over time, she developed a close friendship with the Dixon family, who lived nearby. Thomas Dixon and his wife Mary were well known in the area, regarded as steady, respectable neighbors. Their home was similar to the Britland house, modest and neatly kept, reflecting the values of the working-class community. Mary Ann visited them on occasion, assisting with small tasks or sharing brief moments of conversation. To observers, this connection appeared natural, an extension of the neighborly support that families often relied upon in times of hardship. As the weeks passed, Mary Ann's visits became more frequent. People noticed her stepping across the threshold of the Dixon home with increasing regularity, sometimes carrying small items, other times arriving empty-handed. Her presence did not raise concern. Rather, it was interpreted as a sign of gratitude and camaraderie. She had recently faced a devastating loss, and the Dixons' companionship offered comfort and stability. In turn, Mary Ann offered help where she could, easing some of the domestic burdens that Mary Dixon managed each day. Their interactions remained polite and detached, consistent with the social norms of the time. However, within the confined rooms of the Britland home, another shift began to take shape. Mary Ann's daughter experienced occasional bouts of discomfort, subtle at first but gradually more noticeable. She complained quietly of stomach pains and restlessness, symptoms that could easily be dismissed as common ailments. Children in the area often suffered from minor illnesses due to poor sanitation, limited nutrition, and exposure to the harsh industrial environment. The girls' complaints did not seem unusual or urgent, and Mary Ann tended to her with the same calm attention she'd shown toward her husband. She prepared simple meals, encouraged rest, and carried on with her household responsibilities. To anyone observing from outside, the situation appeared manageable and ordinary. Yet within the home, the girl's condition worsened over time. Her restlessness grew more pronounced, and her moments of discomfort became more frequent. She lay in her room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the house, while Mary Ann moved quietly through the hallway, her footsteps measured and deliberate. The narrow stairway leading to the room creaked under Mary Ann's weight as she carried blankets or small dishes. Neighbors occasionally heard faint movements, subtle evidence of a household grappling with another wave of illness. But even these sounds failed to raise alarm. Illness was a constant presence in the community, and families handled such matters privately, turning to medical assistance only when absolutely necessary. Mary Ann remained composed throughout her daughter's decline, maintaining her routines with steady discipline. She visited the Dixons with the same frequency as before, her presence marked by the quiet reliability that many associated with her character. The Dixons, unaware of the growing troubles within the Britland home, welcomed her assistance. Their routines continued unaffected, shaped by the steady rhythm of daily life. The small street, lined with identical houses and filled with the familiar hum of working families, gave no indication of the events unfolding behind closed doors. As days passed, the girl's symptoms intensified. She experienced sudden spasms and bouts of severe discomfort that left her weakened and fearful. Mary Ann tended to her with unwavering composure, adjusting her bedding, offering small sips of water, and observing her silently as the episodes passed. The room grew dimmer as the curtains were drawn, the light filtering in only faintly. Outside, the neighborhood carried on in its usual rhythm, unaware that another life in the Britland household was moving toward a critical point. The death of Thomas had already cast a shadow over the home, and now another wave of distress settled upon it as Mary Ann's daughter's condition worsened. The small room, once a place of quiet rest, became a space filled with tension and anticipation. The narrow bed creaked under the girl's shifting weight as she struggled against the symptoms that overwhelmed her. Mary Ann's presence remained steady, her movements deliberate and controlled. She prepared small remedies, adjusted the room's temperature, and maintained an unwavering watch over her daughter. In the final days, the girl's strength diminished rapidly, her breathing grew shallow, and her body trembled with each episode of pain. The house fell into near silence, the sounds of the neighborhood muted by the heavy air within the room. Mary Ann remained near the bedside, her expression unchanged. She carried out her responsibilities with the same calm precision that had defined her character throughout the earlier tragedy. The moment of the girl's passing came quietly, marked by a final stillness that settled over the room like a dim shadow. The neighborhood awoke the next morning to the news of another death in the Britland home. Shock rippled through the community, though muted by the understanding that illness could strike suddenly and without clear reason. People expressed sympathy, offering gentle words and small gestures of support. Yet beneath their condolences lay a faint but growing sense of unease, an unspoken question lingering in their minds. How could one household endure two such tragedies in such a short span of time? It remained only a whisper, a subtle shift in the air as the shadow of the second death settled into the narrow rooms of the Britland home, while the small pantry, with its quiet secrets, stood unchanged and undisturbed. The passing of Mary Ann's daughter cast a deeper stillness over the house than even Thomas's death had done. The quiet that settled there felt heavier, as though the narrow walls themselves absorbed the grief and held it in place. Neighbors moved carefully around the subject, offering gentle expressions of sympathy that drifted through open doorways like cool air. Yet beneath these polite remarks lay a growing sense of confusion. Losing a husband was sadly common in their community. Losing a child, though tragic, was not entirely unusual. but losing both within such a short time unsettled those who lived close enough to observe the rhythms of the Britland home. The neighborhood was slow to speak openly, but even the most restrained families sensed an odd pattern forming. They concealed their unease beneath soft nods and murmured condolences, choosing empathy over speculation, at least for the moment. Inside the house, Mary Ann moved with the same unbroken composure she had shown after Thomas's death. Her preparations for the funeral were carried out methodically. She spoke little about the loss, offering brief, measured statements when necessary, but otherwise maintained her routines with steady intention. Her restraint was noted by some who expected a deeper display of grief, yet the culture of the time permitted a wide range of emotional responses. Women often bore their difficulties silently, and many believed sorrow was best carried privately, away from the public eye. Mary Ann's behavior did not stand out sharply enough to draw outright suspicion. Instead, it was absorbed into the broader understanding of hardship within working-class families, where survival sometimes demanded restraint rather than emotional release. The small room where her daughter had spent her final days was cleaned and restored shortly after the funeral. Bedding was washed, drawers straightened, and the window opened to allow fresh air to disperse the lingering heaviness. The narrow bed stood neatly made, its covers pulled tight, giving no hint of the distress that had unfolded there. Mary Ann managed the task with quiet determination, showing neither hesitation nor visible sorrow. Her movements suggested a desire to erase the signs of suffering, to restore the household to a form of orderly normalcy. Yet the emptiness of the room, its silence more pronounced than any physical absence, remained a stark reminder of the profound loss the family had endured. As days turned into weeks, Mary Ann resumed her customary visits to the Dixon household. The Dixons welcomed her with familiarity, unaware of the growing questions that lingered within the neighborhood. Thomas Dixon, a man known for his steady temperament and reliable work ethic, appeared to appreciate her company. Mary Dixon, his wife, maintained her own routines with the same diligent care expected of women in their community. Their home bore the warmth and stability that the Britland house now lacked, and Mary Ann's presence there became an increasingly regular part of their daily life. She helped with small chores, engaged in calm conversation, and created an impression of quiet supportiveness. Some neighbors noticed the frequency of her visits and exchanged subtle glances when they saw her crossing the threshold of the Dixon home. Their observations, though hesitant, hinted at a developing closeness. Yet no one dared voice their thoughts openly. Social norms discouraged intrusive speculation, and it was common for women, especially those recently widowed, to lean on the companionship of friends or neighbors. Thus, Mary Ann's presence in the Dixon household was accepted as part of a natural and understandable relationship, even if a few people harbored unspoken doubts. Within the Dixon home, the routines felt markedly different from those of the Britland house. The rooms carried a steadier warmth. The kitchen bore the scent of well-prepared meals, and the conversations tended to flow more easily. Mary Ann inserted herself into this environment with practiced subtlety, assisting Mary Dixon with domestic tasks and offering help where needed. Yet her attention often seemed to drift toward Thomas Dixon, whose calm demeanor and steady presence appeared to draw her interest. Neighbors, observing the small shifts in her behavior, later recalled a sense of unease that tightened gradually over time, though none acted upon it in those early weeks. The tragedy in her own household seemed explanation enough for any desire to seek comfort elsewhere. Amid these changes, Mary Dixon herself became increasingly fatigued. She complained of mild discomfort, though at first the symptoms were vague and easily dismissed. The physical demands of household management could weigh heavily on women, and occasional illness was common. The symptoms she described resembled those of many others in the community, shaped by poor ventilation, limited nutrition, and the constant strain of domestic labor. Her fatigue deepened over several days, prompting subtle concern from Thomas Dixon, who urged her to rest when possible. Mary Ann, ever present during this period, offered assistance with unwavering reliability, stepping into tasks Mary Dixon temporarily set aside. The dim light of the Dixon home cast long shadows across the kitchen as Mary Dixon's condition worsened. She grew weaker, struggling to maintain her routines, and often retreated to bed earlier than usual. Small tasks that once required little effort now seemed to exhaust her. She experienced bouts of nausea, cramping, and unexplained stiffness, symptoms that puzzled her husband. Mary Ann remained nearby, offering her support as calmly as ever. She prepared tea, tidied the kitchen, and carried out household duties with quiet efficiency. Her presence seemed reassuring in the moment, though in retrospect, observers questioned the ease with which she assumed control of certain tasks, particularly those involving food and drink. The community took note of Mary Dixon's illness with measured concern. Although illness was far from rare, the timing struck some as unusual. The memory of the recent deaths in the Britland home lingered, and whispers began to circulate with slightly less restraint than before. People spoke cautiously, their words shaped by curiosity rather than accusation, yet the pattern was becoming too defined to ignore entirely. Still, no one confronted the matter directly. The connection between the two households seemed close enough to explain Mary Ann's involvement, and the illnesses appeared different enough not to suggest a shared cause. The true significance of these events remained just out of reach for most observers. As Mary Dixon's symptoms intensified, her household became quieter and more subdued. Thomas Dixon moved between concern for his wife and gratitude for Mary Ann's assistance. The atmosphere in the home shifted, carrying a sense of unease that neither husband nor wife could fully articulate. Mary Ann's composure remained intact, and she offered carefully measured reassurance when needed. Yet her presence, once interpreted as a comfort, began to feel heavier, as though an invisible tension followed her from room to room. The signs were subtle, observable only in hindsight, but they suggested a shift in the balance of the household's dynamics. The day of Mary Dixon's death arrived with an unsettling calm. The sky outside remained overcast, casting a muted light that drifted through the windows. Inside the house, Mary Dixon's breathing grew strained, intermittently disrupted by spasms that left her exhausted. Her husband stayed close by, increasingly frightened by the severity of her symptoms. Mary Ann moved through the house with the same precise rhythm she had displayed in her own home during previous illnesses. She prepared a simple cup of tea, placed it carefully on the bedside table, and stepped back into the shadows of the room. As the episodes grew more intense, the household seemed suspended in a state of anticipation. The quiet creaking of furniture, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, and the subdued murmurs of concern filled the air as Mary Dixon's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her final moments unfolded with an abruptness that left those present stunned. The spasms ceased, her breathing slowed, and a heavy silence filled the room. Thomas Dixon, overwhelmed by shock, struggled to comprehend the suddenness of her passing. Mary Ann offered steady, composed assistance, guiding him through the painful tasks that followed. The news of a third death connected to Mary Ann circulated through the neighborhood with hushed urgency. The sense of unease that had been growing quietly now deepened into something more tangible, though still unspoken. The pattern had become unmistakable, even if the reasons behind it remained hidden. 3 lives, linked by proximity and timing, lost within a span that defied coincidence. And as the Dixon home fell into mourning, one memory lingered in the minds of those who had observed the days leading to Mary Dixon's death. The quiet moment when she accepted a cup of tea prepared by Mary Ann, its steam rising softly into the dim room. The memory of that quiet moment in the Dixon household lingered faintly, a detail that would later return with unsettling clarity. For now, it existed only as a passing recollection in the minds of those who had seen or heard about the small gestures exchanged between the two women. After Mary Dixon's death, the neighborhood settled into a muted rhythm, shaped by shock, but restrained by the conventions of working-class life. People spoke softly at doorways and shared brief, puzzled glances as they went about their routines. The idea that 3 sudden deaths could occur in such close proximity to one woman was not yet a spoken suspicion, but the thought hovered at the edges of conversation, waiting for the right moment to take shape. The pattern, for most, remained vague and unformed, overshadowed by the belief that illness and misfortune were frequent visitors to their crowded streets. Inside the Dixon home, the atmosphere grew heavy with grief. Thomas Dixon moved through the rooms in a state of quiet disbelief, his footsteps slow and unsteady. The small house, once lively with the familiar routines of married life, now felt disjointed and hollow. He found simple tasks difficult, as though the absence of his wife had disrupted the very rhythm of the house. Chairs sat slightly askew, dishes remained untouched, and articles of clothing lay where Mary Dixon had last placed them. The silence that followed her passing was more profound than the one that had settled over the Britland home, perhaps because the loss had been so abrupt and so deeply unexpected. Thomas struggled to navigate the sudden emptiness, and neighbors who visited him noted the exhaustion etched across his face. Mary Ann's presence during these days was steady and consistent. She visited the Dixon home with the same calm demeanor she'd exhibited throughout her own tragedies. She assisted with the household chores, carefully folded linens, prepared meals, and offered quiet companionship to Thomas. Her movements were measured, deliberate, and familiar. Some observers later remarked that she appeared more comfortable in the Dixon home than in her own, as though she had found a space where her presence felt purposeful and necessary. Yet others sensed a subtle shift in her behavior, a quiet confidence that had not been as evident before. The mourning environment seemed to strengthen her sense of control rather than diminish it. Mary Ann's involvement in the Dixon household deepened as Thomas struggled to regain stability. He spent long hours contemplating the suddenness of his wife's decline, attempting to recall the small details of her illness. The confusion surrounding her death weighed heavily on him, though he expressed little outward distress. Mary Ann's steady presence provided a sense of structure during these disorienting days. She guided him through practical matters, offered reassurance when he faltered, and helped maintain the house with meticulous attention. Her assistance allowed him to navigate his grief without falling into complete despair, yet her influence also grew more pronounced as time passed. The neighborhood, observing these developments, remained cautious in its interpretations. Some viewed Mary Ann's involvement as the natural extension of a long-standing friendship. They saw a woman who had recently endured severe losses offering comfort to a grieving neighbor, both individuals connected by shared hardship. Others, however, felt a faint unease. They noted how quickly Mary Ann stepped into the routines of the Dixon household and how smoothly she assumed responsibilities that Mary Dixon had once carried out with ease. Though these observations did not yet crystallize into suspicion, they hinted at a growing tension beneath the surface of community life. Meanwhile, inside the Britland home, the traces of the recent tragedies remained subdued but present. Mary Ann spent less time there, preferring the familiar warmth of the Dixon household. The rooms she once tended with regular care now stood in partial disuse, their silence broken only by her occasional return to maintain basic order. The pantry, once the center of many domestic tasks, felt colder and more isolated. The bottle on the shelf, now sitting slightly apart from the other items, had not been moved since the early days of Thomas's illness. Its quiet presence no longer blended seamlessly into the environment, though no one from the neighborhood had cause to examine it or consider its purpose. For now, it remained a forgotten object in a slowly emptying space. As the weeks passed, Mary Ann's visits to the Dixon home became so regular that they were scarcely noted by neighbors anymore. She moved between the two houses with ease, her steps familiar on the narrow pathway. Thomas Dixon, though overwhelmed by grief, began to rely on her presence. He accepted her help gratefully, often expressing appreciation for her steady companionship. In turn, Mary Ann appeared increasingly comfortable in her role as caretaker and confidant, moving freely through the rooms of the Dixon home as though they belonged to her. The dynamic between the two became one of quiet interdependence, shaped by loss but reinforced by routine. Yet the lingering unease within the neighborhood did not fully fade. The recent deaths remained fresh in the minds of those who had observed the unfolding events from a distance. They wondered at the strange pattern linking the tragedies, even if they could not articulate their concerns. The fact that illness had overtaken 3 people, connected by proximity and personal relationships, stirred uncomfortable thoughts. Still, the lack of concrete evidence or clear motive prevented these thoughts from progressing into active suspicion. People chose, for the moment, to treat the tragedies as misfortune rather than something more deliberate. It was during this period of quiet uncertainty that a subtle detail began to resurface in the memories of those who had been near the Dixon home before Mary Dixon's death. A few recalled the moment when Mary Ann had prepared and delivered a cup of tea to the ailing woman. The memory was faint, almost incidental, overshadowed by the grief that followed. But as conversations drifted from one household to another, the detail appeared repeatedly, each time carrying a slightly sharper focus. The tea had been offered with calm care and accepted without suspicion. It seemed a natural, even comforting gesture at the time. Yet now, in the context of the growing unease, the image felt strangely significant, though still difficult to interpret. Within the Dixon home, life gradually settled into a slow, heavy routine. Thomas attempted to re-establish order, though the effort cost him more energy than he possessed. He moved through the rooms as though navigating unfamiliar territory, his grief shaping every decision. Mary Ann's presence, once a source of support, now began to shape the household in more profound ways. Her guidance, subtle yet firm, directed how tasks were completed and how the environment was maintained. She spoke with quiet authority, offering suggestions that Thomas often accepted without question. Her influence, though not overtly dominant, began to settle into the structure of the household with increasing weight. Outside, the streets remained active with the daily rhythms of industrial life. Children ran along the cobblestones, the sounds of mills drifted across the rooftops, and the faint scent of coal hung in the air. The community's routines continued almost unchanged, even as whispers of concern traveled from house to house. People wondered privately whether illness could truly explain the recent pattern of deaths, or whether something more troubling might lie beneath the surface. Their questions, though still unspoken in public, marked the beginning of a gradual shift in perspective. It would take time for these quiet doubts to find voice, and for the threads of the unfolding events to weave themselves into a clearer picture. For now, the Dixon home stood as a place of mourning, its rooms filled with the echoes of recent tragedy. Mary Ann moved within it with steady composure, shaping its routines while the memory of the cup of tea lingered faintly, like a whisper at the edge of awareness. And outside, in the dimming evening light, a shadow passed across the Dixon home, settling quietly as the neighborhood braced itself for whatever might come next. The shadow that passed across the Dixon home seemed to settle over the entire street, though no one could precisely name the reason for the growing tension. It existed as an unspoken awareness, a subtle shift in the way neighbors regarded the recent events. They continued their daily routines, yet their glances lingered a moment longer near the Dixon doorway, and their conversations softened whenever Mary Ann's name surfaced. Still, the silence remained intact. People hesitated to voice their suspicions, partly out of respect for the tragedies that had unfolded, and partly because they lacked any solid explanation for what they felt. Misfortune was common in their world, and 3 sudden deaths, though troubling, could still be explained by illness, poor health, or simple bad luck. The thought of anything more sinister seemed excessive, a leap too large for a community accustomed to endurance rather than speculation. Inside the Dixon home, the routines that Mary Ann shaped began to feel increasingly natural to Thomas. He relied on her presence to navigate the tasks that now overwhelmed him. She prepared meals, organized the household items left in disarray by grief, and offered companionship during the quiet evenings when the absence of his wife felt most profound. Her movements through the house were quiet and steady, giving the impression of a calm, guiding presence. Yet beneath her composure lay an attentiveness that suggested she was carefully monitoring the environment around her. She observed Thomas's needs, adjusted her behavior accordingly, and placed herself in a position of subtle influence within the home. To neighbors, the closeness between Mary Ann and Thomas seemed understandable. They were linked not only by the loss of Mary Dixon, but also by the earlier tragedies in Mary Ann's own household. Shared grief often created bonds that extended beyond typical social boundaries, offering comfort in times of distress. Still, a few observers noticed a slight change in Mary Ann's demeanor. She seemed more confident inside the Dixon home, more deliberate in her actions, and somewhat distant when interacting with others in the community. Her exterior calm remained intact, yet the quiet intensity beneath it gave some people pause. They could not fully articulate their discomfort, nor could they justify it. They tucked their doubts away, sharing them only in cautious whispers when certain ears were listening. It was during this period that Mary Ann's visits to the Dixon home extended well into the evening hours. She became a fixture within the household, arriving early to help Thomas manage his responsibilities and leaving late after ensuring the house was in order. Her presence grew so familiar that few questioned it openly. Yet even as she settled into this new role, subtle shifts began to shape the direction of the unfolding events. The memory of Mary Dixon's illness and the peculiar detail of the cup of tea prepared by Mary Ann resurfaced in quiet conversations among women who had observed the days leading to Mary Dixon's death. They spoke softly about her sudden decline, noting that her symptoms seemed sharper and more abrupt than those associated with common illnesses. Although they avoided suggesting any clear cause, their tone hinted at concern. Inside the Dixon home, Thomas's attempts to regain emotional balance were slow and uneven. The emptiness left by his wife's death weighed heavily on him. His work suffered, his meals often went unfinished, and he spent long evenings lost in thought. Mary Ann offered gentle encouragement during these moments, guiding him away from despair and toward the routines she helped create. Her influence grew steadily, not through overt instruction, but through the quiet, persistent presence she maintained. She became a stabilizing force in the home, shaping its rhythms while observing Thomas's reactions to her involvement. Despite her efforts to maintain order, small inconsistencies began to emerge in her behavior. One neighbor recalled seeing Mary Ann leave the Dixon home late at night with an expression that seemed unusually strained, as though she were preoccupied by something she could not easily conceal. Another neighbor mentioned noticing her speaking with Thomas in hushed tones near the doorway, their postures stiff and tense. Although these moments passed quickly and were easily dismissed as ordinary expressions of grief, they collectively contributed to a growing sense of unease within the community. The pattern of tragedy that surrounded Mary Ann, once interpreted as unfortunate coincidence, now began to appear less random in the minds of those who observed her closely. Still, no one acted on these concerns. Victorian society, particularly in working-class communities, favored discretion and restraint over confrontation. The possibility of foul play was rarely considered unless undeniable evidence emerged. Illness was a more comfortable explanation, aligning with the community's experiences and expectations. The deaths, though alarming in number and proximity, could still be interpreted as the unfortunate result of environmental conditions, poor nutrition, or lingering infections. People clung to these explanations, hoping to maintain the fragile sense of stability their routines provided. As more time passed, Mary Ann's connection to the Dixon household deepened further. She continued to visit regularly, often arriving before Thomas left for work and staying until after he returned. Her presence became almost an assumed part of daily life. Yet the unease that had settled over the street continued to grow. More than once, neighbors observed her glancing toward the Britland home with an expression that could not be easily read. The house, once filled with the ordinary noises of family life, now felt empty and quiet. The pantry stood undisturbed, its shelves neatly arranged, the bottle resting silently among the other items. It had not been used in weeks, yet it remained a persistent reminder of the earlier tragedies, a silent object holding its secrets with unsettling ease. The shift that changed the course of the story began with a faint but troubling development inside the Dixon household. Thomas, already weakened by grief, started to experience occasional bouts of discomfort. At first, he attributed them to stress, poor appetite, or exhaustion. The symptoms were mild: brief episodes of cramping, sudden dizziness, or unexplained tension in his limbs. Mary Ann took note of each occurrence, her expression unreadable. She offered him remedies, encouraged rest, and maintained her usual composure. Yet her watchfulness carried an intensity that some later recalled as unsettling. As Thomas's symptoms persisted, Mary Ann increased her involvement. She prepared more of his meals, insisted on maintaining the household routines, and positioned herself as an essential figure in his day-to-day life. Her influence over him grew stronger as his physical weakness increased. The dynamic between them shifted subtly, shaped by her calm authority and his vulnerable state. The pattern that had emerged in the Britland home and later in the Dixon household now began to take on a more recognizable shape, though still hidden beneath the surface of ordinary domestic life. One evening, as the shadows lengthened across the narrow street, a neighbor noticed Mary Ann leaving the Dixon home with a slow, deliberate pace. She paused briefly near the gate, glancing back at the house with an expression that carried a strange mix of determination and contemplation. The neighbor, unsure of the meaning behind the gesture, watched her disappear into the dim light, her steps echoing faintly on the cobblestones. Inside the Dixon home, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to steady himself. The room felt unusually cold, the air thick with a heaviness he could not explain. He reached for a cup Mary Ann had prepared earlier, lifting it slowly before setting it back down, his unease growing. The faint echo of footsteps in the hallway reminded him of the days leading to his wife's death, and an unsettled feeling spread through him. It was this lingering unease, this subtle deterioration of health and stability, that marked the true beginning of the community's suspicion. Though no one yet understood the pattern or the cause, the Dixon household had become the center of quiet, accumulating tension. And in the dim kitchen, the tea that Mary Ann had prepared cooled silently on the table, its surface unmoving as the house held its breath. The tea sat cooling on the kitchen table, its faint scent drifting upward as the silence in the Dixon home grew thicker with each passing minute. Thomas remained seated, his hands resting on the worn wood, as though anchoring himself against the uneasy sensations rising within him. The room around him, once warmed by the rhythms of domestic life, now felt strangely hollow. Shadows lengthened along the walls, cast by the dim light that filtered through the narrow window. It was in this muted space, surrounded by the silence left behind by Mary Dixon's passing, that Thomas began to experience the first unmistakable signs of something more troubling than grief or exhaustion. The discomfort that had crept into his body over the past days now returned with a sharper intensity, taking hold in sudden waves that left him breathless and disoriented. He attempted to rise from the chair, but paused as his legs trembled beneath him. The familiar kitchen seemed to tilt slightly, as though the steady confines of the room no longer obeyed the rules he trusted. The symptoms were subtle, yet deeply unsettling, arriving in brief bursts that left him momentarily weak before easing again. He tried to attribute them to stress, to the cumulative strain of the tragedies he had endured, but a growing sense of dread pressed against the edge of his thoughts. The cycles of pain and relief reminded him too vividly of the final days of his wife, of the strange and rapid progression of her illness, and the memory tightened around him like an invisible grip. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its usual rhythm. Children's voices drifted faintly from the street, mingling with the distant hum of the mills. Neighbors moved between their homes, sharing brief conversations beneath the drifting evening light. Yet even in the midst of these familiar sounds, a quiet undercurrent of unease moved through the community. People had not forgotten the recent tragedies, nor the peculiar pattern that linked them. Though the connection remained unspoken, the shadows cast by these events lingered in the minds of many. The Dixon home, once a place of order and routine, now stood as a silent reminder of the uncertainty that had settled over the street. Within the house, Thomas made a slow effort to stand and move toward the small window. The cool air from the night brushed against his face, offering a brief moment of relief. He steadied himself on the windowsill, leaning forward as he attempted to gather his strength. His mind wandered back to the days before Mary Dixon's death, to the moments when she had complained of discomfort that seemed to arrive and recede with inexplicable rapidity. He remembered her confusion, her fear, and the suddenness with which her condition had worsened. The parallels were difficult to ignore. Though he could not explain the sense of foreboding growing within him, it gathered like a slow-forming storm, building quietly behind his thoughts. Mary Ann, meanwhile, moved along the darkened street toward her own home. Her steps were steady, her posture upright, as though she carried no weight from the events unfolding behind her. She did not glance back at the Dixon house again, nor did she hurry along the cobblestones. Her presence, even at a distance, carried the same composure that had defined her character throughout the tragedies. Yet the growing suspicion within the community had begun to cast her in a different light. People who once regarded her with sympathy now observed her movements with a subtle mixture of curiosity and restraint. They wondered about the pattern of deaths connected to her and questioned the calm demeanor she maintained, even as sorrow gathered repeatedly at her doorstep. These questions remained quietly contained within the confines of the community, but they formed the foundation upon which more direct suspicion would later grow. Inside the Dixon kitchen, Thomas clutched the edge of the table once more as another wave of discomfort overtook him. His muscles tightened without warning, his breathing grew uneven, and a cold sweat formed along his brow. The episodes, though brief, carried a sharpness that alarmed him. They bore too close a resemblance to the symptoms he had witnessed in his wife for him to dismiss them entirely. He closed his eyes, attempting to calm himself, yet the memory of Mary Dixon's final hours continued to surface with relentless clarity. Her breathless, trembling form, the abruptness of her decline, and the dim light of the room where she had taken her last breaths, all of it returned with striking vividness, as though those moments were unfolding once more before him. He lowered himself into the chair, feeling a deep fatigue settle into his limbs. The tea on the table remained untouched, its surface now still and cool. The cup, simple and unremarkable, seemed to hold an invisible tension that he could not fully comprehend. It stood as a quiet reminder of the last gesture of care Mary Ann had offered before leaving the house. Its presence in the room grew heavier as the night deepened, its stillness matching the growing unease that filled the air. Meanwhile, in the neighboring homes, conversations drifted toward the recent tragedies with increasing frequency. Women spoke quietly of the unusual illnesses, their faces marked by concern. They recalled the rapid decline of each victim, the similarities in their symptoms, and the peculiar timing of their deaths. One by one, they began to revisit memories that previously seemed insignificant. They remembered Mary Ann's presence during each illness, her composure in the face of suffering, and her subtle involvement in the preparation of food or drink. Though none dared speak openly of such suspicions, the pattern became clearer in their minds. The men in the area, though less inclined to dwell on domestic matters, also took note of the growing tension. Some wondered aloud about the illnesses, discussing the harsh environmental conditions that might have contributed to such tragedies. Yet their questions remained tentative, overshadowed by a reluctance to consider darker possibilities. It was easier to believe in the randomness of misfortune than to accept the possibility of intentional harm. Still, the atmosphere on the street changed. People lingered a moment longer in doorways, their faces marked by a quiet, contemplative hesitation. Inside the Dixon home, Thomas's symptoms grew more pronounced. The pain that had been intermittent now returned more quickly, gripping him with sudden intensity. He struggled to maintain his composure, and his thoughts grew increasingly disordered. The quiet kitchen, once a familiar space of daily life, now felt oppressive. Even the sounds of the house seemed altered. The faint creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the night air, the subtle ticking of the small clock near the stove. Everything felt sharpened, tinged with a subtle sense of threat he had never known before. The memory of Mary Ann's calm expression as she prepared the tea hovered uneasily at the edge of his thoughts. He could not explain the significance of this detail, nor could he fully confront the implications of the pattern forming in his mind. Yet the unease grew stronger, shaping his perception of the room and its shifting shadows. The cup remained on the table, untouched, yet its presence felt increasingly oppressive, as though it marked a turning point he could not yet understand. Outside, the night deepened across the narrow street, settling over the neighborhood with a quiet weight. People closed their shutters and extinguished their lamps, retreating into the fragile comfort of their homes. Yet the growing unease lingered, casting faint shadows that reached from one doorway to the next. And in the Dixon home, as Thomas struggled with the waves of illness that overtook him, the nearest neighbors could not help but notice the faint, strained sounds coming from within, echoes that reminded them all too clearly of the days leading to Mary Dixon's death. It was these sounds, quiet, irregular, and filled with tension, that opened the door to the community's first true sense of suspicion. The faint sounds drifting from the Dixon home in the days following Thomas's decline became an undercurrent that moved through the neighborhood with increasing unease. They were subtle enough to be dismissed at first, little more than the strained movements of a grieving man attempting to navigate the loneliness that had settled over his home. But those who listened closely recognized a familiar pattern beneath the muffled groans and irregular thumps. These were the same sounds that had preceded Mary Dixon's death, and before that the troubling decline of Mary Ann's husband and daughter. Though no one spoke openly of these similarities, the collective memory of the street began to sharpen, linking the recent events into a pattern that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. It was not customary for working-class neighbors to intrude upon each other's private matters. The boundaries between households, though physically narrow, were maintained with respect and restraint. People offered assistance when needed and extended condolences when tragedy struck, but they rarely questioned the internal workings of another family's home. Yet as the days passed and the sounds from the Dixon household continued, the silent agreement to look away began to weaken. Women paused in their chores to listen, their expressions marked by concern. Men walking home from work slowed their steps as they passed the Dixon doorway, uncertain whether the noise inside was the result of grief, illness, or something far more troubling. Inside the house, Thomas was caught in a cycle of symptoms that came and went with unpredictable intensity. He experienced sharp cramps that radiated through his limbs, episodes of stiffness that left him momentarily paralyzed, and waves of dizziness that blurred the edges of his vision. These symptoms, though alarming, remained intermittent enough that he could cling to the hope that they would pass. He attributed them to exhaustion and emotional strain, convincing himself that the weight of recent events had simply overwhelmed his body. Yet beneath this fragile reasoning lay a growing fear, shaped by the memory of his wife's rapid decline and the unsettling similarity of their experiences. Mary Ann continued to visit Thomas during this period, offering assistance with the same steady composure that had defined her behavior in the months before. She arrived at his doorstep with quiet regularity, her presence becoming a constant fixture in the household. She prepared meals, tidied the rooms, and managed the daily tasks that Thomas now struggled to complete. Her movements were efficient and calm, giving no outward indication of concern or distress. To an outsider, she appeared as a devoted friend offering support to a grieving neighbor. Yet to those who observed the pattern more closely, her presence carried a different weight, one that increasingly aligned her with the unfolding tragedies. The memory of the cup of tea she had prepared for Mary Dixon began to resurface in the neighborhood's quiet conversations. Women recalled the moment with subtle unease, sharing their observations in hushed tones. They spoke of Mary Dixon's rapid decline, of the strange rigidity that overtook her body, and of the unsettling similarities between her final symptoms and those now afflicting her husband. Though none dared suggest foul play openly, the repeated pattern gnawed at their sense of security. The quiet street, once a place of predictable routines, now felt overshadowed by an unspoken tension that stretched from one household to the next. Inside the Dixon home, Thomas's condition worsened gradually. He spent more hours in bed, his strength diminishing with each passing day. The once comforting familiarity of his surroundings now felt heavy and oppressive. The walls of the small bedroom seemed to close in, the air thick with the memory of his wife's suffering. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, Mary Ann's steps, steady and measured, became both a source of comfort and unease. Her presence provided practical assistance, yet her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing fear that settled over him during each episode of pain. He could not explain the sense of dread that accompanied these moments, nor could he fully confront the implications of the pattern forming in his mind. As the symptoms intensified, Thomas began to experience the same sharp convulsions that had marked Mary Dixon's final days. These episodes struck without warning, gripping his body with sudden, excruciating force. His muscles tightened, his limbs stiffened, and his breath came in strained gasps. The sensations were overwhelming, leaving him disoriented and terrified. When the episodes passed, they left behind a deep exhaustion that made even the simplest movements difficult. He clung to the hope that rest would bring relief, yet each new wave of pain reminded him of the unstoppable progression of his wife's illness. Mary Ann observed these developments with her characteristic calm. She offered Thomas water, adjusted his bedding, and reassured him with quiet, measured words. Her composure during these moments appeared almost unnatural to those who later reflected on the events. She showed no visible signs of fear or confusion, only a steady focus that guided her movements through the room. To Thomas, her presence was both a comfort and a mystery. He relied on her assistance, yet the memory of the tragedies that had unfolded around her cast a shadow over his trust. Still, in his weakened state, he was in no position to question her involvement or withdraw from her care. Outside the home, the neighborhood's sense of unease continued to grow. People noticed Mary Ann's regular presence at the Dixon household and exchanged subtle glances as she passed along the street. They watched her movements with increasing attention, noting the calm precision of her steps and the way she carried herself. Some wondered privately whether her involvement in the recent tragedies was coincidental or whether something more troubling connected her to the series of deaths. These questions remained confined to quiet conversations, yet the pattern they suggested became increasingly difficult to ignore. The turning point began quietly, without dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation. It emerged instead from a growing sense of recognition among those who had observed the unfolding events. Women recalled the symptoms experienced by Mary Ann's husband and daughter, noting the similarity to Mary Dixon's illness and now to Thomas's decline. Men, though more reluctant to consider such possibilities, began to acknowledge the unsettling pattern. The repetition of sudden unexplained illnesses linked to one woman could no longer be dismissed as mere chance. Even without a clear understanding of the cause, people sensed that something profoundly wrong had taken root in their community. Within the Dixon home, the air grew increasingly heavy as Thomas's condition deteriorated. His breathing became labored, his movements inconsistent, and his expressions marked by a deepening confusion. His thoughts drifted in and out of clarity, shaped by fear and the physical strain of his symptoms. He attempted to speak of his concerns, yet his words faltered, caught between the desire to express his fear and the disbelief that such a possibility could exist. Mary Ann remained by his side, her presence steady and controlled, guiding him through each episode with quiet efficiency. It was during one of these episodes, as the night pressed heavily against the walls of the small home, that the transition to the next phase of the story began. Thomas's symptoms reached a peak that left him barely able to move, his body stricken with sharp, uncontrollable spasms. Mary Ann remained close, her expression unchanged, observing him with the same calm focus she had shown throughout the previous tragedies. The dim light of the room cast her silhouette against the wall, creating a quiet yet unsettling image that lingered in the edges of Thomas's fading awareness. Outside, the street lay still, the air thick with the weight of unspoken suspicion. Neighbors, sensing the tension within the Dixon home, approached their windows with careful steps, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns. They listened, unable to turn away, as the familiar sounds of distress echoed once more through the narrow street. It was in this moment, as the quiet night carried the echoes of Thomas's suffering, that the community's unease began to solidify into something more tangible, a recognition that the tragedies unfolding around them could no longer be explained by chance alone. And the quiet that followed, heavy and unresolved, marked the beginning of the inquiry that would soon turn silent suspicion into formal investigation. The gentle knock at Mary Ann's door marked the beginning of a shift that had been gathering quietly beneath the surface of the neighborhood for weeks. It was not a forceful sound, not the sharp rap of an urgent visitor, but rather a measured, deliberate tap that carried the weight of a growing suspicion. When Mary Ann answered, she confronted the calm, composed presence of a local constable who stood with a notebook in hand, his expression serious but restrained. He introduced himself with formality, explaining that he wished to speak with her about recent events. His tone was polite, but the underlying purpose of his visit was unmistakable. The authorities, having received concerns from more than one member of the community, had decided it was time to examine the string of tragedies that had unfolded in such close succession. Inside the small home, Mary Ann offered the constable a seat, maintaining the same reserved composure she had shown throughout the earlier misfortunes. Her demeanor gave no outward indication of alarm or defensiveness. She answered his questions with calm, measured statements, describing the illnesses that had claimed her husband and daughter with a degree of detachment that the constable found notable. He recorded her words carefully, noting her descriptions of their symptoms, the timing of their decline, and the limited medical intervention they had received. Her responses were clear and consistent, yet the constable sensed a subtle distance in her recollections, as if she were describing events that had happened to strangers rather than members of her own household. The constable then shifted the conversation toward the Dixon family, asking about her involvement during Mary Dixon's illness. Mary Ann spoke with the same steady tone, recounting her efforts to support her neighbor and the rapid progression of the sickness. She mentioned the preparation of tea, the long hours she spent by Mary Dixon's bedside, and her role in assisting Thomas after the loss. Her statements were delivered with a calm assurance that bordered on practiced repetition. Yet the constable, having already gathered accounts from neighbors, sensed a slight hesitation beneath her composure, a pause so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the delicate scrutiny he had brought with him. As the conversation progressed, he asked whether she had ever purchased chemicals or substances used for pest control, a common practice among households in the area. Mary Ann acknowledged that she had obtained such materials in the past, citing her need to maintain a clean and orderly home. She explained their use in practical terms, emphasizing their ubiquity in working-class domestic life. Her explanation was plausible, even predictable, yet the constable noted once more the controlled nature of her responses, as if each word had been chosen with careful precision. After the discussion concluded, Mary Ann escorted the constable to the doorway with the same modest courtesy she had shown throughout. He thanked her for her cooperation, but his polite demeanor did not conceal the concern etched into his features. As he stepped away, he carried with him a growing certainty that the pattern of events required closer examination. The quiet suspicion that had once drifted aimlessly through the neighborhood now took form within the constable's mind, shaped by the consistency of her tragedies and the calm precision with which she recounted them. In the days that followed, the authorities revisited the circumstances of each death connected to Mary Ann. They reviewed the original medical assessments, which had attributed the illnesses to natural causes or unexplained conditions common in crowded industrial communities. Yet the similarities between the cases now appeared too distinct to overlook. The abrupt onset of symptoms, the rapid progression of each illness, and the peculiar muscular rigidity observed in the final hours of each victim raised troubling questions. Doctors familiar with the symptoms offered tentative explanations, suggesting the possibility of poisoning, though they admitted that the medical understanding of toxic substances remained limited. The constable, gathering these insights, recognized that further inquiry was necessary. He arranged a visit to the local chemists, seeking records or recollections that might establish a connection between Mary Ann and any purchase of potentially dangerous substances. At the first chemist's shop, an elderly pharmacist recalled a woman resembling Mary Ann, who had purchased a small amount of a particular powder used for eliminating rats. The pharmacist could not say with absolute certainty that it was her, yet the timing of the purchase aligned with the period preceding Thomas's illness. At another chemist's, a younger shopkeeper provided a clearer account. He remembered selling strychnine to Mary Ann not long before her daughter's decline. Her explanation at the time that she needed it to control vermin had seemed reasonable, given the prevalence of such issues in the area. Yet now, in the context of the emerging pattern, the memory took on a more troubling significance. Strychnine was a substance commonly used for pest control, available to the public with few restrictions. It was known to be potent, capable of causing severe reactions if ingested by humans. The symptoms it produced, violent convulsions, muscle rigidity, and intense distress, match closely the descriptions offered by witnesses to the deaths of the Britland family members and Mary Dixon. Though forensic science in the early 1880s remained limited, the doctors consulted by the authorities recognized the possibility that strychnine had played a role in the recent tragedies. The constable compiled these observations into a detailed report, outlining the pattern of purchases, the timeline of the deaths, and the consistency of symptoms across each case. His growing certainty led him to consult with the coroner, who agreed that the circumstances warranted a more thorough examination. The coroner ordered the exhumation of Thomas's body, along with the remains of Mary Dixon, to allow for chemical analysis that might reveal traces of toxic substances. The decision to exhume the bodies marked a turning point in the investigation. Exhumation was a rare and serious measure, reserved for cases in which suspicion had taken firm hold. The news of this decision traveled quickly through the neighborhood, carried in whispers that drifted from doorway to doorway. People reacted with a mixture of shock and quiet validation. The pattern that had troubled them for so long now found expression in official action, confirming their unspoken fears. Though they knew little of the specifics, they understood enough to recognize that the authorities were no longer viewing the tragedies as isolated incidents. Mary Ann responded to the news with the same calm composure that had marked her behavior throughout the investigation. She denied any wrongdoing, expressing confusion at the authorities' decision. Her outward reactions were measured and restrained, yet beneath her calm exterior lay a tension that neighbors began to observe more clearly. Some noticed her avoiding their gaze, her steps a bit quicker than usual, her posture slightly more rigid. Others sensed that her once steady composure had shifted, revealing faint cracks beneath the surface. The atmosphere around her grew increasingly strained, shaped by the recognition that she was no longer simply a grieving widow and mother, but the central figure in a growing criminal inquiry. In the following days, as the exhumation procedures began, the constable visited the Dixon home once more. He inspected the kitchen, the bedroom, and the small pantry, spaces now heavy with significance. He asked Thomas for any remaining items that might help clarify the nature of his illness, though Thomas, still recovering from his recent symptoms, could offer little more than his recollections. The constable examined every detail carefully, taking note of the faint residue left on certain containers, the placement of cups, and the evidence of recent meals. Each observation deepened his conviction that the pattern of events pointed toward intentional harm. Meanwhile, the neighborhood waited in uneasy silence as the investigation progressed. People avoided discussing the matter openly, yet they observed each development with acute attention. The familiar rhythms of the street, children playing, women carrying baskets from the market, men returning from work, seemed muted beneath the weight of unfolding events. The quiet tension that had once lingered in unspoken glances now took form in the presence of authorities moving through the area, conducting interviews and collecting statements. The exhumations began, carried out with solemn care in the early morning hours. The bodies were transported to a nearby facility where doctors attempted to detect any trace of poison. Though the forensic tools available were limited, they were sufficient to identify certain toxic substances. The results, when they emerged, carried the certainty that investigators had feared. Traces of strychnine were found in more than one of the exhumed bodies. The discovery marked a significant turning point, providing the authorities with the evidence needed to move forward. The quiet suspicions held by the community now transformed into a formal accusation, one that would lead to the next phase of the investigation. And as the constable prepared to return to Mary Ann's door with this new information, the neighborhood held its breath, knowing that the quiet inquiry that had begun with a single knock would now become something far more serious. The morning air was cold when the exhumed bodies were returned to the custody of the authorities, but the chill that settled over the community had little to do with the weather. Word traveled quietly, carried not by loud discussion but by the subtle shifts in expression among neighbors, the way people paused in their routines and glanced toward one another as if seeking confirmation that they truly understood what was happening. The discovery of strychnine in the exhumed remains reshaped everything. What had once been a string of misfortunes now became something far more disturbing, something deliberate and calculated. Though the details were not openly discussed on the street, each household seemed to absorb the gravity of the development. People spoke softly behind closed doors, weighing the implications with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Inside the small offices, where the examinations had taken place, the doctors involved in the process reviewed their findings with serious care. Victorian forensic science was still developing, yet certain poisons, including strychnine, left unmistakable signatures. The rigidity of muscles, the contorted posture found in the remains, and the distinct chemical traces confirmed what they suspected. These were not deaths caused by natural illness. The examinations, though limited by the tools of the era, revealed enough to establish a clear conclusion. The authorities received the findings with a mixture of relief and discomfort. They finally possessed concrete evidence, yet the implication that a woman from their community had repeatedly used such a violent poison carried a weight that none of them took lightly. The constable who had spoken with Mary Ann earlier now prepared to visit her again. this time with an entirely different purpose. He reviewed his notes carefully, tracing the timeline of events, the purchases made at the chemist's, and the first-hand accounts of the victim's symptoms. Everything pointed toward a single conclusion. Mary Ann had been present during each decline, her involvement steady and consistent, her calm demeanor masking a pattern of actions that now appeared unmistakably deliberate. The constable, known in the area for his reserved but fair temperament, felt a somber heaviness as he prepared to confront her. Though his role required objectivity, he could not ignore the unsettling fact that this was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was now a matter of evidence. When he arrived at Mary Ann's home, the street was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the narrow walkway. He knocked firmly this time, the sound echoing slightly against the brick terraces. Mary Ann answered with the same poised expression she had worn during the first visit, though there was a faint tension around her eyes, as though she sensed the gravity of what was to come. The constable requested that she accompany him to the station for further questioning, explaining that new information had come to light. Her expression remained calm, but her hands tightened slightly against the frame of the door. She nodded once and stepped back inside to gather a few items, her movements measured, her composure intact. The journey to the station was quiet. The constable walked at her side, his posture formal and restrained. A few neighbors observed from their windows or from the edges of their doorways, their expressions marked by a mix of shock and grim acknowledgement. People who had once offered Mary Ann sympathy now watched her with guarded caution, unsure how to reconcile the woman they had known with the suspicions that now surrounded her. The constable did not explain the full details during the walk. He chose instead to maintain a respectful silence, allowing the weight of the moment to settle naturally. Inside the station, Mary Ann was led to a small, sparsely furnished room where she was asked to sit. The constable placed his notes on the table and explained that the exhumation results had revealed traces of strychnine in the remains of multiple victims. He described the significance of these findings in clear, measured terms, outlining how the pattern of symptoms, the timing of the deaths, and her purchase of the substance collectively raised serious concerns. Mary Ann listened without visible emotion, her expression composed, though the stillness of her posture suggested a deepening tension. When asked whether she had administered any substances to her husband, daughter, or to the Dixons, she denied the accusation calmly, insisting that any chemicals in her possession were used strictly for pest control. The investigators pressed further, asking her to explain the recurring pattern of symptoms, the similarity between each decline, and her presence during all 3 deaths. They questioned why she had purchased strychnine multiple times within a short period and why her explanations to the chemists differed on certain details. Their questions grew more pointed as the interview progressed, each one carefully designed to probe the inconsistencies that had emerged during the investigation. Mary Ann responded with a consistent composure, reiterating her innocence, yet offering explanations that now appeared increasingly fragile in light of the evidence. As the questioning continued, the investigators brought forward the chemist's testimonies, including the shopkeeper who recalled her purchasing strychnine shortly before her daughter's illness. They presented the timeline, showing how each purchase aligned closely with the onset of symptoms in the victims. Mary Ann's responses grew quieter, though still controlled. She offered a mixture of explanations, concerns about rats, the need to control pests, and the coincidence of illness occurring near the time of the purchases. Yet these explanations, which might once have seemed plausible, now felt insufficient. The investigators observed the subtle shift in her demeanor, the slight tightening of her expression, the measured way she answered each question. They sensed that her composure, though still intact, was beginning to strain beneath the pressure. Meanwhile, the news of her questioning spread quietly through the neighborhood. Households whispered behind closed doors, their conversations tinged with disbelief and discomfort. People recalled the earlier tragedies with new clarity, piecing together memories that had once seemed unrelated. They remembered the similarities in the victim's symptoms, the way Mary Ann had moved through each household with calm assurance, and the quiet presence of certain bottles or containers in her kitchen. The pattern, once faint and unspoken, now took on a sharper focus. Even those who had been hesitant to entertain suspicions now found themselves confronting a truth they could no longer ignore. In the station, the investigators continued to build their case. They examined the physical evidence collected from the Dixon home, noting the possible residue found on certain containers and the placement of cups and dishes that might have held contaminated substances. Though the forensic tools of the era were limited, the consistency of the circumstances provided a compelling narrative. The progression of symptoms, the timing of each illness, and the documented purchases formed a chain of evidence that grew stronger with each new piece of information. After several hours of questioning, Mary Ann remained calm yet noticeably strained. The investigators, recognizing the shift, presented her with the final piece of evidence, the official results of the exhumation. The document, written in precise language, confirmed the presence of strychnine in the bodies of her husband and Mary Dixon. The constable placed the report in front of her, allowing her time to absorb its significance. Mary Ann looked at the page with a steady gaze, yet her silence carried a weight that filled the small room. It was in this moment, with the quiet rustle of papers settling against the table and the distant sounds of the street drifting faintly into the room, that the investigation reached a turning point. The authorities had moved from suspicion to certainty, from questioning to accusation. The evidence, though shaped by the limitations of the era, formed a clear and undeniable pattern. And as the constable informed Mary Ann that she would be formally arrested, the room seemed to hold its breath, marking the transition from inquiry to the next phase, one that would soon involve the courts, the public, and the full weight of the justice system. The heavy sound of the key turning in the station door marked the formal beginning of Mary Ann Britland's confinement, and with it, the next stage of the unfolding case. She was escorted from the small questioning room into a narrow corridor lined with pale walls and dim lamps. The constable walked behind her, his steps steady and deliberate, while another officer moved ahead to prepare the necessary documents. The process was methodical, shaped by the structured routines of law enforcement in a Victorian industrial town. Each movement carried an official weight, reflecting the seriousness with which the authorities now regarded her case. Mary Ann did not resist, nor did she display any overt emotion. Her posture remained upright, her expression calm, as though she had accepted this new chapter with the same measured composure she had shown throughout the previous tragedies. Yet beneath her controlled demeanor, there was a tension that clung to her movements, a faint rigidity that betrayed the strain of the situation. The arrest brought a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the police station. Officers who had previously regarded Mary Ann with polite curiosity now observed her with a cautious distance. They moved around her with a formality that signaled the gravity of the charges she faced. The constables conferred quietly as they prepared the paperwork, reviewing the statements collected from neighbors, the chemist's accounts, and the forensic findings. Each document placed before them reinforced the pattern that had emerged during the investigation. Though the station itself was small and modestly furnished, its walls now seemed to hold the collective weight of the evidence gathered against her. Mary Ann was escorted into a holding cell with iron bars that separated the confined space from the corridor. The door closed with a firm, echoing click, a sound that lingered in the stillness that followed. Inside the cell, the furnishings were sparse. A narrow bed, a small wooden bench, and a worn blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The air carried a faint chill, and the dim light cast soft shadows along the stone floor. Mary Ann stood silently for a moment, absorbing her surroundings before lowering herself onto the bench. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable, and her gaze fixed on a point somewhere near the far wall. The stillness in her posture made it difficult to discern whether she felt fear, anger, resignation, or something else entirely. While Mary Ann awaited her next steps, the authorities began to prepare for the formal hearing that would determine whether she would be held for trial. The constable who had led the investigation compiled a detailed summary of the evidence, outlining the timeline of events, the symptoms observed in each victim, and the purchases she had made at the chemist's. He included the exhumation findings, the testimonies from neighbors, and his own observations of her behavior during questioning. The report was thorough, shaped by the diligence expected in a case involving multiple deaths and the suspected use of poison. Victorian law enforcement, though not as advanced as modern investigative methods, relied heavily on clear patterns and corroborated statements. In this case, the consistency of the evidence provided a strong foundation for the charges. Meanwhile, word of Mary Ann's arrest continued to spread through the neighborhood, carried quietly but steadily from house to house. People gathered in doorways, exchanging cautious remarks about the developments. Some expressed shock, struggling to reconcile the calm, reserved woman they had known with the accusations she now faced. Others spoke in low tones of the lingering unease they had felt in recent weeks, the pattern of illness that had troubled them long before the authorities intervened. The news stirred a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a sense of grim validation. The tragedies that had once seemed inexplicable now appeared in a new light, reshaped by the growing certainty that something deliberate had occurred. Inside the station, preparations for the preliminary hearing moved forward with quiet efficiency. The magistrate assigned to review the case was experienced, known for his measured judgment and careful consideration of evidence. He examined the constable's report with close attention, noting the alignment of testimony, the medical findings, and the timeline connecting each event. The use of strychnine, a substance capable of producing severe and unmistakable symptoms, played a central role in his assessment. Though the legal system of the time was limited in its forensic capabilities, the presence of a known poison in the exhumed bodies provided a clarity that few cases of the era possessed. The magistrate recognized that the weight of evidence was sufficient to warrant a formal trial, and he prepared to issue the order that would move the case forward. Mary Ann was brought into the small hearing room the following day. The space, modest in size, held only a few individuals: the magistrate, a clerk, 2 officers, and the constable who had led the investigation. The room's quiet stillness contrasted sharply with the tension that filled it. Mary Ann took her place before the magistrate, her expression calm but distant, as though she had detached herself from the gravity of the proceedings. The magistrate reviewed the charges in a clear, steady voice, outlining the allegations against her. He explained that she stood accused of administering poison to multiple individuals, resulting in their deaths. The words carried a formal weight, echoing slightly within the small room. As the magistrate spoke, Mary Ann listened without interruption. Her demeanor remained steady, though her gaze shifted slightly as he described the evidence linking her to the purchase of strychnine, the progression of symptoms in each victim, and her presence during their final days. The constable observed her reactions closely, noting the faint tightening of her jaw and the slight widening of her eyes when the exhumation results were mentioned. These subtle shifts, though small, suggested the growing strain beneath her controlled exterior. When prompted to respond to the charges, Mary Ann spoke in a quiet but clear voice, maintaining her innocence and attributing the deaths to natural causes and misfortune. Her denial, though delivered with calm conviction, did little to counter the weight of evidence presented by the authorities. The magistrate, recognizing that the case required full judicial examination, ordered her to be held for trial. The decision, though expected, marked a decisive moment in the progression of the case. After the hearing, Mary Ann was escorted back to her cell. The clang of the door echoed once more, creating a brief silence that settled heavily in the corridor. She sat down slowly, her posture slightly more rigid than before, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The controlled composure she had maintained throughout the initial stages of the investigation began to show faint signs of strain. Her breathing grew more shallow, and her gaze drifted toward the small window set high in the wall, through which only a narrow sliver of daylight entered. Outside the station, the streets surrounding the neighborhood carried a subdued but palpable tension. People moved cautiously, speaking in lowered voices as they processed the implications of the arrest. The realization that a woman from their own community might have been responsible for multiple deaths unsettled the foundation of trust that bound the neighborhood together. Families who had once shared meals, exchanged small favors, and offered support during hardship now viewed one another with new caution. The case had disrupted the quiet predictability of their lives, introducing a sense of vulnerability they had not previously experienced. In the days that followed, preparations for the trial began. Statements were compiled, witnesses were identified, and the authorities continued to examine any remaining details. The Dixon home, along with the Britland residence, remained quiet, carrying the lingering weight of the tragedies that had unfolded within their walls. Investigators revisited these spaces with careful attention, seeking any additional clues that might support the case. They examined the pantry where the bottle had once sat, the kitchen where meals had been prepared, and the bedrooms where each victim had taken their final breaths. Though no new physical evidence emerged, the environment itself reinforced the narrative established during the investigation. The stage was now set for the next phase of the story, one that would unfold under the scrutiny of the courtroom. The magistrate's order marked the transition from the private, methodical work of investigation to the public arena of legal judgment. The community, once bound by shared routine, now braced itself to witness the unfolding trial, uncertain of what the final outcome might reveal. And as Mary Ann remained in her cell, awaiting the formal proceedings, the courthouse doors began to open, signaling the start of a chapter that would bring the full weight of the justice system to bear on the case. The heavy courthouse doors opened with a slow, deliberate motion, their thick wooden frames creaking softly as the first day of proceedings began. Victorian courthouses carried an austere presence, their stone walls and towering ceilings casting long shadows that emphasized both the solemnity and the gravity of the legal process. People gathered cautiously near the entrance, their conversations subdued. The case of Mary Ann Britland had stirred a deep unease within the community, drawing curiosity from nearby towns as well. It was not common for multiple deaths in such a short time to be tied together under suspicion of poisoning, and rarer still for a woman to stand accused. The crowd reflected this mixture of shock, concern, and morbid curiosity. Individuals from all walks of life, factory laborers, shopkeepers, housewives, and even a few more affluent residents, arrived hoping to witness some portion of the trial that had already become a topic of whispered speculation across the region. Inside the courtroom, the air felt even more tightly bound with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches lined the space, offering room for observers who soon filled them in quiet clusters. The judge's seat, elevated and imposing, overlooked the entire room. His presence, marked by a firm composure and a steady gaze, established an immediate tone of seriousness. At the opposite side, a long table stood for the prosecution and defense, each prepared with stacks of documents, notes, and reports gathered during the lengthy investigation. The constable who had conducted much of the inquiry remained close to the prosecution, his notes organized neatly in case he needed to recount his findings in detail. When Mary Ann was brought into the courtroom, all eyes shifted toward her. She walked with the same controlled precision that had marked her demeanor throughout each stage of the investigation. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her gaze remained level, avoiding direct contact with the faces observing her. She presented neither defiance nor collapse, but something steadier, a kind of quiet resilience, even if its source remained unclear. Some interpreters saw calmness, others saw calculation, yet all noted the subtle tension that shaped her posture, a quiet rigidity revealing the strain beneath her surface composure. The trial commenced with the formal reading of the charges. The clerk, standing with his papers held firmly in both hands, read aloud the accusations: the deliberate administration of strychnine, leading to the deaths of her husband, her daughter, and her neighbor, Mary Dixon. The language was measured, precise, and unembellished, reflecting the factual nature of the court. The words echoed faintly against the stone walls, reverberating through the room with the weight of their seriousness. As the charges were listed one by one, the courtroom remained silent, the only sound being the distant shuffle of someone adjusting their position on the wooden bench. The prosecution began by laying out the sequence of events in chronological order, emphasizing the consistent pattern of symptoms across all the victims. They described the rapid onset of pain, the severe muscle contractions, the difficulty breathing, and the abrupt nature of each decline. Witnesses who had been present during the victim's final hours had provided detailed accounts, and these were read with a steady, factual tone. The descriptions made clear that the symptoms matched those characteristic of strychnine poisoning, a substance known at the time for its extreme potency. The prosecution did not need dramatic language. The facts themselves carried enough gravity. Next, they presented the evidence gathered from the chemists. The first chemist, an older man with a careful manner, was brought to the stand to describe the sale of strychnine to Mary Ann. He recalled clearly a purchase made at a time closely preceding the onset of Thomas's illness. His account was followed by the younger shopkeeper, who provided a more definitive testimony. He remembered Mary Ann purchasing strychnine again before her daughter's decline, offering an explanation about controlling rats. His recollection was firm, supported by the shop's purchase logs. Together, their accounts formed a clear and troubling pattern, aligning the procurement of poison with the timeline of the deaths. The courtroom listened intently as the constable took the stand. He spoke with a calm, steady voice, guiding the jury through the investigation stages. He described his first interview with Mary Ann, noting her calm demeanor and the controlled precision of her responses. He went on to detail the exhumations, the medical assessments, and the findings of strychnine in the remains of Thomas and Mary Dixon. His testimony was carefully delivered, grounded in documented fact. When he spoke about the similarities in the victim's symptoms, the jury members leaned forward slightly, their faces arranged in expressions of focused contemplation. Nothing in his account suggested exaggeration. Instead, it presented a systematic, consistent narrative. The medical professionals were then called to explain their findings. Victorian forensic science lacked the advanced chemical instruments of later eras. Yet certain poisons left identifiable characteristics even with the limited tools available. The doctors described the signs of strychnine poisoning, correlating them with the rigidity observed in the exhumed remains and the testimonies provided by witnesses. Their explanations, though rooted in 19th century understanding, were clear enough to convey the essential conclusions. The presence of strychnine in the bodies, combined with the symptoms described, supported the prosecution's argument with compelling strength. Throughout this presentation, Mary Ann remained quiet, her expression unchanged. Though she listened closely, she rarely reacted. Her calm demeanor became a point of quiet curiosity among those who observed her. Some interpreted it as acceptance, while others suspected concealment. The prosecution, careful not to speculate on her motives or emotions, focused solely on the factual alignment of evidence. They emphasized the pattern of repeated poison purchases, the timing of each death, and the unmistakable presence of strychnine. Their approach was methodical, reflecting the seriousness of the case and the need for clarity in a matter that had shaken the community. When the defense presented their argument, they focused primarily on questioning the reliability of the forensic results, highlighting the limitations of Victorian medical analysis. They suggested alternative explanations for the illnesses, pointing out that digestive troubles, infections, and environmental factors often produced severe symptoms. They also stressed the societal tendency to scrutinize women in ways that sometimes led to exaggerated suspicions. However, their argument struggled to counter the accumulation of evidence. While they spoke of coincidence and misinterpretation, the repetition of similar symptoms, purchases, and timelines made the explanation difficult for the jury to accept. The defense also attempted to portray Mary Ann as a woman overwhelmed by hardship, someone who had endured loss without support. They described her behavior as quiet resilience rather than calculation, insisting that she had been unfairly cast in a sinister light due to the extraordinary coincidence of her circumstances. Yet this portrayal did not align neatly with the powerful, factual narrative the prosecution had constructed. The jury listened, paying attention to the defense's attempts to sow doubt, but the weight of the evidence remained. As testimony continued, the courtroom's atmosphere grew increasingly somber. The cumulative effect of the accounts, the chemist's records, the constable's investigation, and the medical findings created a story that felt both undeniable and deeply unsettling. Observers shifted quietly on their benches, exchanging occasional glances that reflected a shared recognition. They were witnessing a rare and deeply troubling case, one that would not soon be forgotten. Through it all, Mary Ann sat with her hands folded, her posture steady. She rarely looked toward the witnesses and instead kept her gaze fixed on a point near the judge's bench or on the polished wood of the table before her. Her silence seemed to grow heavier as the proceedings continued. Each new piece of evidence settled over the room like a slow gathering weight. As the day's testimony drew to a close, the judge informed the court that proceedings would continue the next morning. The room slowly emptied, leaving behind the lingering sense of a story still unfolding. People stepped out into the fading afternoon light with quiet expressions, contemplating the implications of the testimony they had heard. The courthouse doors closed slowly behind them, marking the transition from one day of revelation to the next. And inside the building, as the last echoes of footsteps faded, a heavy silence remained, hinting at the significance of what would soon follow: the judge's instructions, the jury's deliberation, and the verdict that would finalize the story's tragic arc. The second morning of the proceedings arrived quietly, with a gray sky settling over the town and a cool breeze moving through the narrow streets. People approached the courthouse with the same slow, deliberate pace as the day before, though their expressions now carried a deeper gravity. The evidence presented during the trial's early stages had left a profound impression. The descriptions of illness, the forensic findings, the timeline of the poison purchases, all of it pointed toward a deliberate pattern that no one in the community could easily reconcile with the quiet, restrained woman seated at the defense table. Even those who had known Mary Ann for years now approached the courthouse with an uneasy sense of certainty. They were no longer attending out of curiosity alone, but out of a shared need to see the process reach its conclusion. Inside, the courtroom filled gradually, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of those who settled into them. The atmosphere carried a hushed tension, as though people understood instinctively that the trial was entering its final stage. The judge took his place with a steady composure, acknowledging those present before signaling that the proceedings would resume. Mary Ann was brought into the room shortly after. Her posture remained upright, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze directed toward the floor just ahead of her feet. There was no visible sign of distress or panic, yet her stillness seemed heavier than the day before, as if she understood that the trial's direction was no longer something she could influence. The prosecution began by summarizing the essential elements of their case, presenting each piece of evidence in a carefully structured narrative. They restated the timeline of each death, noting the symptoms observed by witnesses, the rapid deterioration of each victim, and the presence of strychnine in the exhumed remains. They highlighted Mary Ann's visits to the chemists, her explanations for needing pest control substances, and the clear alignment between those purchases and the onset of illness in her household and the Dixon home. Their tone remained formal and factual, without sensationalism, relying solely on the strength of the documented evidence. The pattern they described was consistent, and its implications were difficult to counter. When the defense responded, they attempted once more to highlight possible alternative explanations. They raised the possibility of contaminated food or water, the presence of environmental toxins common in industrial towns, and the potential for misdiagnosis in a period when medical knowledge was limited. They urged the jury to consider the hardships Mary Ann had endured, suggesting that her calmness in the face of tragedy reflected resilience rather than guilt. The defense spoke of the challenges faced by working-class women, arguing that misinterpretations often arose from societal expectations and the narrow assumptions of the era. Yet even as these arguments were presented, they appeared increasingly fragile. The prosecution's evidence had constructed a narrative that was not easily dismantled by appeals to circumstance or sympathy. Witnesses from the neighborhood were called to recount their observations. They described the patterns they had noticed in the days surrounding each illness, the faint sounds of distress, the suddenness of each decline, and Mary Ann's calm, steady behavior during moments of crisis. None of the witnesses spoke with malice. Their tone reflected quiet recollection rather than accusation, yet their accounts added weight to the prosecution's case. One neighbor recalled seeing Mary Ann prepare a cup of tea for Mary Dixon shortly before her symptoms worsened. Another remembered the increasing frequency of Mary Ann's visits to the Dixon home after her own family's tragedies. These observations, delivered without embellishment, contributed to the growing sense that the sequence of events had not been accidental. The chemists who had testified earlier returned briefly to reaffirm their statements. Their records had been examined carefully, and their accounts remained consistent. The purchases of strychnine were documented in their logs, and their recollections of Mary Ann's explanations had not wavered. Their testimonies provided clear evidence that Mary Ann had acquired the substance multiple times, each purchase aligning with a death. The prosecution emphasized this pattern once more, noting that strychnine, though commonly sold for pest control, had no legitimate domestic use that matched the timing or frequency of her purchases. As the final pieces of testimony were presented, the judge prepared to deliver instructions to the jury. He reviewed the case with meticulous care, ensuring that each element was understood in its proper context. His tone remained calm and authoritative, guiding the jury through their responsibility to weigh the evidence objectively and without bias. He reminded them that the standard of proof required certainty beyond reasonable doubt, and that their decision must rest solely on the facts presented during the trial. He emphasized the seriousness of the charges, noting that the deliberate administration of poison was among the gravest offenses considered by the court. Mary Ann listened to the judge's instructions with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the trial. Her expression revealed little, though the faint tightening around her eyes suggested the strain of the moment. The courtroom remained still as the judge directed the jury to retire to the deliberation room. The members of the jury rose from their seats and filed out quietly, leaving behind a silence that filled the space with a heavy sense of anticipation. The hours that followed were long and filled with subdued tension. People waited patiently on the benches, speaking only in low murmurs to avoid disturbing the solemnity of the moment. Some stepped outside briefly to breathe the cool air, returning quickly in case the jury reached its decision sooner than expected. The constable who had led the investigation remained near the prosecution table, reviewing his notes with a thoughtful expression, though his focus shifted repeatedly toward the closed door behind which the jury deliberated. The judge stayed in his chambers, prepared to reconvene the moment the jury signaled their readiness. Mary Ann sat in silence during this waiting period, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze downward. She appeared as though suspended in a moment of quiet reflection, her thoughts known only to herself. Her posture remained rigid, her shoulders held slightly higher than before, suggesting the weight of uncertainty pressing down upon her. The courtroom seemed to narrow around her, its silence amplifying the presence of each individual awaiting the verdict. After several hours, the door opened and the jury filed back into the room with deliberate, solemn steps. The judge returned to his seat. The courtroom rose briefly and then settled once more into silence. The foreman of the jury stood, holding the piece of paper on which their decision had been recorded. His voice was steady as he read the verdict, yet his expression reflected the gravity of the words he delivered. Guilty. The words settled over the room with a quiet finality. There were no gasps or cries, only a profound and heavy silence as the verdict absorbed into the walls of the courtroom. Mary Ann remained still, her face composed, yet pale, her eyes focused on a distant point that only she could see. She did not collapse, nor did she protest. Her composure, remarkable in its steadiness, remained unbroken even as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. The judge's voice carried a solemn weight as he outlined the consequences of the verdict. His words, though carefully measured, reflected the seriousness of the offenses. The deliberate taking of multiple lives through the use of poison was a crime that the court could not overlook. The sentence, delivered with clarity and gravity, marked the end of the trial and the beginning of the final stage of Mary Ann's story. As she was led from the courtroom, the observers remained seated, watching her departure with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and resignation. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her, signaling the conclusion of the public proceedings. The courtroom slowly emptied as people stepped back into the fading afternoon light, their thoughts heavy with the weight of the verdict they had witnessed. And as silence settled once more over the courthouse, the sound of footsteps receded into the corridor, marking the transition from the trial to the last chapter of Mary Ann Britland's fate, a chapter that would unfold behind the walls of the prison where she would now await her final days. The walls of Strangeways Prison rose sharply against the muted skyline, their narrow windows and looming stonework casting long shadows across the courtyard as Mary Ann Britland entered to begin the final phase of her confinement. Victorian prisons were places of rigid structure and minimal comfort, designed less for rehabilitation than for containment and order. Their routines were strict, their expectations uncompromising. Inside these walls, time seemed to move at a different pace, marked not by the rhythm of daily life, but by the clang of cell doors. The measured footsteps of wardens and the echo of distant voices carried along cold corridors. As Mary Ann was escorted through the prison's entrance, the finality of her situation settled more firmly around her. She had arrived not as a visitor or a temporary detainee, but as a condemned woman, awaiting the most severe sentence the court had the authority to impose. Her cell was small, barely large enough to accommodate the narrow bed, a simple stool, and a small basin placed neatly in one corner. The walls were bare, their rough texture illuminated faintly by the limited light that filtered through the high, narrow slit of a window. The air held a cool, damp quality that seemed to seep into the bones, a constant reminder of the austerity of her surroundings. Mary Ann stood silently for several moments after the guards closed the heavy door behind her, observing the confined space with an expression that revealed little. She set her few allotted belongings neatly at the foot of the bed before sitting down with slow, deliberate movements. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the stone floor, her posture upright, as though bracing herself against the weight of the days to come. Prison life for condemned inmates followed a different rhythm from that of the general population. The schedules were more controlled, the surveillance more frequent, and the moments of personal solitude narrower. Mary Ann was observed closely by the matron responsible for female prisoners, an experienced woman accustomed to overseeing inmates facing a range of circumstances, from petty crimes to the most serious offenses. The matron approached her duties with quiet firmness, maintaining a measured distance from the prisoners while ensuring their basic needs were met. She visited Mary Ann regularly, speaking to her in calm tones and providing clear instructions about the routines of the day. Mary Ann responded with the same controlled composure she'd displayed throughout her trial, listening attentively, offering brief replies, and following the prescribed rules without protest. In the early days of her confinement, Mary Ann spoke very little. She rose when instructed, folded her bedding precisely as required, and sat quietly during the periods allocated for reflection. The matron observed that she moved through the routines with careful deliberation, as though attempting to impose order on the small world now assigned to her. She ate her meals with slow, measured bites, though she often left portions untouched. Her silence was not sullen, nor did it appear rebellious. Instead, it reflected a kind of inward turning, a withdrawal into quiet contemplation that made her both easy to supervise and difficult to understand. The prison chaplain began visiting her shortly after her arrival. A man of solemn demeanor and steady compassion, he had seen many prisoners in their final days and approached his role with calm clarity. He offered spiritual guidance without pressure, speaking to Mary Ann about repentance, forgiveness, and the gravity of her situation. At first, she responded with polite detachment, listening without expressing strong sentiment. As the days passed, her engagement deepened slightly. She asked small, direct questions, her voice quietly composed, and she occasionally nodded in acknowledgement of his words. Yet she maintained a measured distance, as though unwilling to reveal her innermost thoughts, even in the face of her impending fate. Outside the prison, the verdict continued to ripple through the community. People spoke of the trial in subdued tones, reflecting on the tragedies that had preceded it and the unsettling realization that a woman they had once regarded as quiet and ordinary had been convicted of repeatedly administering poison. Some expressed sorrow, recalling their earlier interactions with Mary Ann and struggling to reconcile those memories with the court's findings. Others felt a quiet sense of relief, believing that justice had been served and that the sequence of unexplained illnesses had finally been understood. Yet no one spoke with triumph. The case had left a mark on the community that was not easily erased, shaped by the recognition of how little they had known about the events unfolding behind closed doors. Back inside Strangeways prison, Mary Ann's days settled into a quiet rhythm. She spent time seated at the small stool, her hands folded, her gaze often fixed on the narrow line of light entering through the window. The stillness of the cell gave her time to reflect, though the content of her thoughts remained known only to herself. The matron noted her continued composure, remarking that she was neither disruptive nor despondent, but maintained a steady calmness that seemed almost detached. Occasionally, Mary Ann asked for small tasks to occupy her hands, a piece of cloth to fold, a small item to organize, simple actions that provided structure within the limited confines of her space. These requests were granted when possible, offering her a small measure of routine in a place where most choices had been removed. As the date of her execution approached, the chaplain increased his visits, offering quiet words of support and reflection. He spoke of forgiveness, both divine and personal, and of the peace he hoped she might find in her final days. Mary Ann listened intently, her face marked by a stillness that suggested she was weighing his words carefully. Though she did not speak at length, she responded with a quiet dignity, acknowledging the gravity of her situation. The guards who observed these interactions noted the absence of agitation or outward fear, though they recognized that internal turmoil could remain unseen. The prison routines continued with unwavering consistency. The clang of distant doors, the echo of footsteps in the corridor, and the muted sounds of other inmates formed a backdrop to each day, reminding Mary Ann of the isolation that attended her sentence. She received no visitors from the outside world. The events leading to her conviction had severed the fragile ties she once held. Her world had become increasingly small, bounded by the walls of her cell and the brief, structured interactions permitted by the prison staff. On one of the final evenings before her execution, the chaplain sat with her longer than usual. He read passages aloud in a steady voice, pausing occasionally to allow her time to reflect. Mary Ann listened closely, her hands clasped tightly, her breathing slow and measured. She did not cry, nor did she speak at length, but she nodded quietly, offering a brief acknowledgement, that revealed a depth of contemplation difficult to fully interpret. The matron observed from a respectful distance, noting the quiet gravity of the moment. When the night ended, the prison fell into its usual silence, broken only by the faint sounds of guards moving along their designated paths. Mary Ann lay on her narrow bed, her eyes open for several hours before she finally allowed herself to rest. The moonlight that filtered through the window cast a faint glow across the stone floor, illuminating the stillness of the cell. Morning arrived quietly, marked by the low toll of the prison bell, a sound that resonated through the corridors with solemn finality. The matron approached Mary Ann's cell with calm professionalism, her voice gentle, as she instructed her to prepare for the final walk. Mary Ann rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her expression composed. She straightened the blanket on her bed, folded her hands, and nodded once to signal her readiness. And as the faint echo of the bell continued to vibrate through the prison walls, the final chapter of her story began to unfold, shaped by the weight of the past and the irrevocable decisions that had brought her to this moment. The final morning of Mary Ann Britland's life unfolded with a steady, measured quiet that seemed to mirror the gravity of the hours ahead. The air within Strangeways prison was cool, carrying the muted echoes of early footsteps and the faint rustle of uniforms as guards began their routines. There was no haste, no raised voices, no sign of disorder. Instead, the atmosphere held a stillness shaped by solemn duty and the understanding that this day marked the final step in a long and difficult process. When the matron approached Mary Ann's cell, her expression remained composed, reflecting a mixture of professionalism and the quiet compassion that had guided her interactions over the preceding weeks. She unlocked the door with deliberate movements, speaking softly as she informed Mary Ann that the time had come. Mary Ann rose slowly from the narrow bed, her posture controlled and steady. She had slept in brief intervals throughout the night, her mind turning repeatedly to the chaplain's final words and the memories that had surfaced as she contemplated her fate. Yet when she stood, she did so without visible hesitation. She smoothed the fabric of her clothing, adjusted the folds so they lay neatly, and nodded once to signal her readiness. The matron stepped aside as Mary Ann walked into the corridor, accompanied by two guards who maintained a respectful distance. Their steps echoed faintly through the hallway, a rhythmic sound that marked their progress toward the chapel, where the chaplain waited to offer final prayers and words of comfort. The chapel, though modest in structure, held an air of quiet reverence. Light filtered through the narrow windows, illuminating the wooden pews and the small altar at the front. The chaplain stood near the doorway, greeting Mary Ann with a gentle inclination of his head. His voice remained low and steady as he led her toward the small space prepared for their final conversation. He spoke of peace, of forgiveness, and of the stillness that might follow a life's final moment. Mary Ann listened intently, her face marked by a calmness that suggested a sense of acceptance, though whether that acceptance reflected resignation, reflection, or exhaustion remained unclear. She responded with brief acknowledgments, offering small, measured phrases that conveyed gratitude without revealing the full depth of her inner thoughts. The chaplain read a passage chosen for its solemnity and quiet hope, pausing occasionally to allow the words to settle in the still air of the chapel. Mary Ann stood quietly, her gaze lowered, the faint light casting soft shadows across her features. She did not show visible fear, nor did she ask questions about what would follow. Her silence held a weight that reflected the culmination of weeks of contemplation, shaped by the recognition that the events leading to this moment could no longer be altered. When the chaplain concluded his reading, he offered a final blessing, speaking with the careful cadence of someone accustomed to guiding individuals through their final hours. After the blessing, the guard stepped forward once more, signaling that the time had arrived for the final walk. The chapel door opened quietly, and Mary Ann stepped into the corridor with a measured pace. The path toward the execution chamber was short, yet carried an immense gravity. Each step echoed faintly along the stone floor, marking the progression toward a conclusion that had been determined by the court and reinforced by the weight of evidence. The guards walked beside her, maintaining their steady composure, their faces reflecting the solemnity of their duty. The execution chamber itself was plain, devoid of adornment or unnecessary detail. The space was designed for function and formality, its simplicity reflecting the structured procedures that govern such moments. The executioner, a man of calm professionalism, prepared his equipment with deliberate precision, ensuring that each element was arranged according to protocol. He did not speak unnecessarily, and his movements were efficient and respectful. The officials present maintained a quiet demeanor, their presence required by law but marked by the same subdued gravity that filled the rest of the prison. Mary Ann stepped into the chamber without hesitation, her posture upright, her gaze steady. The atmosphere held no dramatic tension, no raised voices, no outward display of emotion. Instead, it carried the weight of finality, shaped by the recognition that this moment represented the closing of a chapter that had troubled both the community and the justice system. The executioner guided her into position with calm instructions, ensuring that she was prepared for the procedure that would follow. She complied without resistance, her actions reflecting a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. As the preparations concluded, the room grew still, the faint sounds of movement replaced by a silence that felt heavy and respectful. The officials observed the proceedings with the solemn attention required of them. The chaplain stood nearby, offering silent prayer as he watched the final steps unfold. Mary Ann remained composed, her breathing even, her posture steady. In these last moments, the complexity of her story, her calm demeanor, the tragedies that had preceded the investigation, the steady progression of the trial, and the evidence that had brought her to this point, seemed to converge into a single, quiet instant. The execution was carried out with the efficiency characteristic of the period, its procedures governed by strict guidelines to ensure swiftness and adherence to the law. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden movements, only the routine completion of the task assigned to the officials present. It occurred quickly, the final moment passing with stark simplicity. The weight of the event lingered in the air only after the procedure had ended, settling over the room like a muted echo of the gravity that had shaped the preceding months. Once the formalities were completed, the officials withdrew in quiet sequence. The executioner moved with the same careful professionalism he had shown throughout, and the chaplain remained for a brief moment longer, offering quiet words of prayer before stepping away. The guards followed their prescribed duties, each action reflecting the structured nature of the process. Outside the chamber, the stillness of the morning deepened. The news of the execution would reach the community gradually, carried first through official channels and later through quiet conversations. For many, the event would serve as a somber conclusion to a story that had shaken their understanding of the people around them. The deaths of Thomas Britland, the Britland daughter, and Mary Dixon would no longer be clouded by uncertainty. The verdict, the trial, and the execution had provided a definitive answer, one that reflected both the legal judgment of the court and the collective sense of finality felt by the community. In the days that followed, conversations about the case remained measured and subdued. People reflected on the tragedies with a mixture of sorrow and uneasy acceptance. They contemplated the quiet exterior that had concealed the events within the Britland home and the Dixon household, the understated demeanor that now seemed to carry a deeper, more troubling significance. Some expressed sympathy for the victims, recalling the days of illness and the lingering uncertainty that had once shaped their understanding of the events. Others considered the gradual emergence of suspicion, the progression of the investigation, and the careful, deliberate work of the authorities who had pieced together the pattern of poisonings. As time passed, the story of Mary Ann Britland became part of the region's history, a case remembered for its unsettling nature and the clarity with which it revealed the dangers concealed beneath ordinary routines. The quiet terrace streets where the tragedies had unfolded regained their familiar rhythm, though a subtle awareness lingered, shaping the way neighbors regarded the events of the past. The community carried lessons forward, lessons about vigilance, about the hidden complexities of those around them, and about the slow, deliberate work required to uncover truth. And so the story closed, not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet finality characteristic of the age. The houses where the events unfolded remained standing, their brick walls absorbing the passing years, while the memory of the case settled into the fabric of local history. It remained a reminder of the fragility of trust and the steady, careful processes that bring clarity to even the darkest chapters of human experience.